It wasn't like we'd been living in some mansion, or that our house was a symbol of wealth, but it was our house. The place where we had our birthdays, Christmas mornings, and those quiet Sunday afternoons. It wasn't just a building, it was a home, a part of who we were. So when I first heard the news that my mom sold our house, I was hit with a sense of disbelief that I couldn't shake. The house. Seriously. What had happened to get to this point? And then it all came flooding in, the deeper reason behind the decision. It wasn't a sudden whim. It wasn't a drastic act made on a whim of panic. No, this was a decision made after months, maybe even years of mounting pressure, with my brother's debts being the tipping point. And let me tell you, when you have to make that kind of call as a parent, it doesn't come easily. There's no peace in selling the home you've worked your entire life to build. No comfort in making that kind of sacrifice for someone else's mistake. I could hear the disbelief in my mom's voice when she told us. There was no anger, no bitterness, just resignation. She wasn't upset about the house itself, though she probably should have been. What hurt her wasn't the fact that the roof was being taken off our heads. It was what that roof had come to symbolize. It was the weight of the years of effort, the emotional strain that had brought her here, and the hope that we could somehow turn this around before it got to this point. But we didn't. And let's be real. I couldn't wrap my head around it. My brother's debts weren't small. They weren't the kind of bills you just forget about. They were the kind of debts that gnaw at you in your sleep, that pile up over time until they swallow everything in sight. He'd gotten himself into trouble with bad financial decisions, maybe even some naive risk-taking. But none of us realized how deep he was in it until it was too late. And that's where it really got to me. Was this really the way we were going to solve it? Sell our family home, the one thing we thought was secure. It's funny how much a house means. It's not just walls and a roof. It's the space where you grow up, where you fight, laugh, and sometimes even cry. And to think that all of that could be erased to pay off someone else's mistakes. Well, that hit harder than I thought it would. But there was no time for second guessing. My mom had made her choice. And in some twisted way, I understood why she did it. But that didn't make it any easier to accept. So here I was, sitting with this bombshell of a decision, trying to digest what had just happened. My mom had sacrificed so much for us, for him. And now we were left with no place to call our own. It wasn't just the financial burden we had to bear. It was the emotional toll that this decision left behind, the damage it did to our sense of security. I could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken questions that hung between us. How did we get here? And, more importantly, where do we go from here? Looking back, it's hard to pinpoint the exact moment when things started to go off the rails. It's easy to say, oh, I should have seen this coming, or we could have done something sooner. But the truth is, the signs were there, just tucked away behind the noise of everyday life. My brother had always been a bit of a spender, someone who saw credit as an easy way to get what he wanted in the moment, not fully grasping the consequences down the line. At first it was small stuff, new clothes, gadgets, a vacation here and there. Nothing too alarming, just the kind of purchases you make when you're trying to keep up with your peers, trying to enjoy life. But then things began to change. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the small debts grew into bigger ones, and it wasn't just about a few missed payments or an unpaid credit card bill. We were talking about loans, interest rates, and deepening financial commitments he couldn't see his way out of. The tipping point, though, came when he made a series of bad investments. He got involved in a business venture with a group of people who were supposed to be experts, promising fast returns and big payouts. My brother, always eager to take a shot at the next big thing, jumped in without fully understanding the risks. It seemed like a surefire way to get ahead, and for a while it felt like it could be. But as the months went by, the promises turned into broken dreams. The investments failed, and his financial obligations snowballed. And that's when the real crisis hit. It wasn't just about owing money anymore. It was about the weight of the lies, the secrets. First, he hid it from us. We had no idea the true extent of his debts. He'd always been good at masking it, pretending like everything was fine. But the cracks started to show when he could no longer keep up with the payments. He'd come home looking more and more anxious, and we'd notice him getting defensive when we asked about his finances. At one point, I overheard him talking on the phone with a collection agency. That's when the sinking feeling hit me. Something was very, very wrong. When we finally found out the full extent of his financial situation, the shock was unbearable. My mom was devastated. For months, she'd been wondering why he was acting differently, why he seemed stressed all the time, but she never imagined it was this bad. We learned that the debts had piled up to a point where it was almost impossible to figure out where to start. His credit score had tanked. His assets were tied up in bad investments, and he had taken out loans that he could never repay. It wasn't just money anymore. It was a huge emotional burden that was weighing down the entire family. I remember the day we finally sat down to talk about it. My mom was crying, asking him why he hadn't told her sooner, why he'd let it get this far. My brother, for the first time, seemed truly ashamed. He was at his breaking point, admitting that he didn't know how to get out of it, and to be honest, I didn't either. We were all looking at a mountain of debt that seemed insurmountable. The weight of it was crushing us. My mom, always the strong one, was crumbling under the stress. And we, his siblings, felt betrayed, not just by his actions, but by the fact that we hadn't seen how bad things were. As much as I wanted to understand where he was coming from, I couldn't shake the feeling of resentment. My brother wasn't a child anymore. He was an adult, fully capable of making decisions and taking responsibility for them. But instead of confronting the problem head-on, he'd buried it, hidden it behind layers of excuses. My mom had been picking up the pieces for years, running on fumes, and now the rug had been pulled out from under us. And I couldn't help but wonder, how could he let this happen? How could he put all of us in this situation? What made this all worse was the guilt. My mom, especially, felt a deep sense of responsibility. She'd spent her life trying to protect her children, trying to ensure we had everything we needed. And now here she was, facing the harsh reality that her own son's mistakes were going to cost us everything. And even though she tried to assure us that she had everything under control, I could see the worry in her eyes. I could see the emotional toll it was taking on her. She kept saying that she had to fix it, that we couldn't let this destroy us, but deep down, I knew this wasn't just about money anymore. It was about her emotional well-being, her sense of security, and her ability to hold everything together. And that's when things really started to shift. This wasn't just about paying off debts. This wasn't just about trying to fix a financial mistake. This was about sacrifice. My mom's sacrifice. She was about to give up the one thing that had held us all together. The family home. It wasn't just about selling property. It was about tearing down the emotional fortress we'd built over the years. And when you've worked so hard for something, when you've poured your heart and soul into a place, it's impossible not to feel the sting. But for my mom, it wasn't a choice. It was the only choice she could make. She had to do whatever she could to save our family. And in her mind, selling the house was the only way to do that. When my mom first sat us down to explain what she had decided to do, I could see the weight of her decision pressing on her chest. It wasn't just about selling our house. It was about everything that had led to this point. The quiet years of financial strain, the mounting pressure of trying to provide for us while keeping up the appearance of normalcy. I could see it in her face. The exhaustion, the quiet desperation. She wasn't just a parent making a financial decision. She was a woman who felt she was at the end of her rope, pushed into a corner by her son's reckless choices. In that moment, it wasn't just the decision that was heartbreaking. It was the realization that this wasn't the future she had imagined for us. She had always worked so hard, putting everything on the line to ensure we had a good life. She'd sacrificed so much over the years. Late nights, early mornings, missed holidays, all to provide. And yet here she was, facing a decision that would leave us without a home, uprooting the one constant in our lives. The gravity of that hit me harder than I expected. For a moment, I wasn't angry at my brother, or even at the situation we were in. I was heartbroken for my mom. The person who had always been the strongest, the most dependable, was now the one carrying the heaviest burden. I kept asking myself, why did she choose this path? She could have walked away. She could have given up, let us all fend for ourselves, and just let my brother's mistakes take their toll. But that wasn't her way. She had always been the type of person who would bend until she broke, if it meant saving the people she loved. She didn't just want to fix this situation for herself. She wanted to fix it for all of us. It was this constant need to protect, to give more than what was asked, to sacrifice even her own happiness for the sake of our well-being. It wasn't until I saw her in that moment that I fully understood the weight of parental sacrifice. But it wasn't just the financial weight of selling our home that was tearing her apart. It was the emotional cost. She was already emotionally drained, constantly balancing work, bills, our upbringing, and somehow keeping a smile on her face. And now, she had to swallow the fact that her sacrifice, this final, devastating decision, was the result of my brother's reckless choices. No matter how hard she tried to shield him, protect him from the consequences of his actions, there was no escaping the impact. The emotional toll this decision took on her wasn't something she could just brush off. She was giving up the very thing that represented years of hard work, dreams of security and stability. And even though she insisted that it was the right thing to do, I could see how much it tore her apart. Every time she talked about it, her voice cracked, and she'd pause to hold back the tears. What really broke me was hearing her say, "I don't know what else to do." In those words, I could hear the exhaustion, the guilt, and the hopelessness. I had always seen my mom as the strong one, the person who had all the answers, the one who could fix anything. But now, in the face of such a monumental decision, she was just human. She was vulnerable. And in that moment, I understood just how much of herself she had given up for us, how much she was still willing to sacrifice, even when the price seemed too high. I couldn't imagine the emotional strain she was under, having to choose between her son's future and her own, between the family home that had been the backdrop of so many memories and the deep, crushing weight of the debts that had dragged us all into this crisis. It wasn't just a decision, it was a moment of reckoning. She wasn't just paying off debts. She was paying the price for years of putting others before herself, of trying to do everything for everyone. But I didn't fully understand this at the time. My focus was on the house, the place where we had grown up, and the fact that it was slipping through our fingers. But looking back, I see the bigger picture. My mom didn't just sell a house. She sold the very thing that had given us stability, that had been the anchor in all of our lives. And she did it with no guarantee that anything would get better afterward. But she made that choice, and as difficult as it was, she believed it was the only way to give us a chance at moving forward. In her mind, paying off my brother's debts, removing that heavy burden from our shoulders, was worth it. She was willing to risk everything for a shot at family unity, for a chance at redemption. And though it's easy to sit back and criticize a decision like this, the reality is, she was doing what she thought was best. And as much as I didn't like it, I knew she was doing it out of love. Love for us, love for my brother, and, in a way, love for herself too. The moment my mom made the decision to sell our house, everything in our family changed. The foundation that had once been so solid beneath us, the one constant in our lives, was suddenly ripped away. And, honestly, the emotional toll it took on all of us was much harder to deal with than I had ever imagined. It wasn't just about the house being sold, but about what it represented. Security, memories, a sense of place. Our home had been the backdrop to every major event in our lives. We'd celebrated birthdays there, fought in the kitchen over stupid things, gathered on Christmas mornings with excitement and joy. It was more than a house. It was our anchor, the one thing that kept us grounded, no matter what life threw our way. So, when that was taken away, it felt like we were drifting in a sea of uncertainty. The most immediate effect was on my mom. She'd always been the rock of the family, the one who kept us all together through thick and thin. But now, I could see the weight of the world on her shoulders. She tried to keep up the appearance of normalcy, to continue being the supportive, loving mother she always had been. But I could see the cracks. I could see how tired she was, how deeply this decision had shaken her. It wasn't just about the practical aspects of it, the packing, the moving, finding a new place. It was the emotional fallout. She had to reconcile the idea that she was giving up something for us, something that had meant so much to her personally. And yet, despite the exhaustion, despite the emotional strain, she kept going. She kept saying it was the right thing to do. But I knew deep down it was eating away at her. Then there was my brother. He had no idea how deeply his actions were affecting everyone. In his mind, he was just trying to get out of the mess he'd created, but the emotional weight of the situation hadn't hit him yet. He saw the house as an unfortunate necessity, a step toward fixing the financial mess he'd dragged us all into. But he hadn't really taken the time to think about how much it hurt us all. I couldn't understand how he could be so detached, how he could let this happen to the people who had always supported him. I felt betrayed, not just by his debts, but by the way he'd let it all spiral out of control without considering the toll it was taking on the family. It wasn't just the money. It was the emotional cost, the strain it placed on everyone's relationships. And it wasn't just me who felt this way. The tension between my brother and my mom was palpable. She had sacrificed so much for him over the years, giving him the benefit of the doubt every time, protecting him from the consequences of his actions. And yet, here he was, not fully grasping the magnitude of the sacrifice she had just made. It wasn't just about paying off debts anymore. It was about the fact that we were all paying the price emotionally and mentally for his mistakes. The trust between them began to erode, and while my brother tried to make things right, the guilt that my mom carried, combined with the resentment I was beginning to feel, was creating a rift that was hard to bridge. It wasn't just the financial strain that was the problem. It was the emotional strain that accompanied it. The house, the place we had all thought of as home, was now gone. And in its place, there was a deep void that we were all struggling to fill. We didn't just lose our physical space. We lost a piece of our identity. We lost the comfort of coming home to a place that felt like ours. And what made it worse was that we couldn't even fully mourn it. We couldn't talk about how much it hurt, how much we missed it, because there was this overwhelming sense of responsibility that we had to shoulder. For him. My mom had made this sacrifice for him, and the emotional toll that it took on her and on the rest of us was immense. The other siblings and I were left in the middle, caught between supporting my brother, our loyalty to him, and supporting my mom, who was struggling to keep the pieces of her own life together. And let me tell you, trying to navigate that balance was like walking a tightrope. No one knew exactly how to react. We weren't sure if we should feel angry at my brother, or if we should feel sorry for him. There were moments when we all tried to be understanding, but there were also moments where the anger and resentment seeped through. It was hard to avoid. It was hard to pretend that everything was okay when, in reality, the entire foundation of our family had been shaken to its core. The hardest part, though, was the unspoken tension between us all. Everyone was walking around with these hidden feelings, guilt, resentment, sadness, but no one was really talking about it. My mom, as usual, tried to keep it all together, but I could see how much she was holding in. And my brother. He was trying to make amends, but it was clear that the emotional damage had already been done. There was a heaviness in the air, this constant sense of walking on eggshells. Everyone was so careful about what they said, afraid to push the wrong buttons or make things worse. And the truth was, no one really knew how to make it better. The emotional toll was just too great. As we moved forward, I realized something important. The decision to sell the house wasn't just about money. It was about the emotional sacrifice we had to make as a family. The house was just a symbol of the deeper emotional work that needed to be done. And even though we could no longer go back to our old lives, the emotional rebuilding was just beginning. But how do you rebuild after something like that? How do you move forward when everything you've known has been upended? And that's where things got complicated. It's funny how a single decision, one that you thought would bring relief, can tear apart a relationship that once felt unbreakable. That's exactly what happened when my mom sold our house. On the surface, it looked like a simple financial move, a sacrifice made for the greater good. But underneath it all, there was a growing tension between me and my brother that neither of us knew how to address. My brother, the one who had caused this mess, was still reeling from the reality of what had happened. But, as the days turned into weeks after the sale, I began to feel a quiet resentment building inside me. Resentment that I hadn't expected, and that I didn't know how to deal with. First, I tried to brush it off. After all, he was my brother. He was family. We were supposed to stick together, right? And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that he had betrayed us, especially my mom. His debts, his decisions had led us here. He'd put us in this position, without fully considering the consequences for the rest of us. And now we were left trying to rebuild our lives, all while carrying the weight of his mistakes. Felt unfair. And what made it worse was that he didn't seem to fully understand the magnitude of what we had lost. The tension between us was subtle at first. It wasn't like we were shouting or fighting, but it was there, simmering beneath the surface. Every time I looked at him, I couldn't help but remember the sacrifices my mom had made. I remembered the tears she shed, the hours she spent packing up the house, trying to make the transition as smooth as possible. And yet, he didn't seem to grasp the emotional cost. It wasn't just the money or the house. It was everything that came with it. He was apologetic, sure. But his apologies felt hollow to me. Like he didn't really understand what we had all given up. There were moments when I tried to talk to him to express how I felt. But every time it felt like he was more focused on his own guilt than on understanding my perspective. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he would say, his voice full of regret. But those words didn't help. They didn't change the fact that our family had been torn apart by his financial irresponsibility. And as much as I wanted to forgive him, I couldn't let go of the feeling that we had all been betrayed. I couldn't stop feeling like he had put us in this position and then walked away from it all, leaving us to clean up the mess. It wasn't just me who was feeling this way. My mom, despite everything, was still doing her best to shield him from the full brunt of the consequences. She was trying to protect him, trying to help him make things right, even though the weight of it all was crushing her. But I could see the strain in her eyes, the unspoken tension between her love for him and the anger she was holding back. She was sacrificing everything for him, and yet there were no guarantees that he would learn from his mistakes. And that, to me, was the hardest part. How could we trust him again after all of this? How could we forgive him when he hadn't even truly faced the depth of what he had done to our family? I know my brother loved us. I know he was sorry. But love and apologies weren't enough for me. There was something deeper, something raw, inside of me that needed to be acknowledged. I needed to feel like he truly understood the impact of his actions. I needed to feel like he wasn't just sorry because he had lost everything, but sorry because he realized how much we had lost in the process. The betrayal wasn't just about money. It was about trust. Trust that had been built over years. The unspoken understanding that family takes care of each other, that no one would put the others in harm's way. And now that trust was shattered. The unspoken agreement that we would always have each other's backs was broken. I couldn't look at him without remembering how his decisions had affected my mom, how his irresponsibility had forced her to make choices she never should have had to make. And even though we tried to move on, to act like things were okay, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between us. It wasn't just about the financial debt he owed. It was the emotional debt that now hung between us like a thick fog. There was no easy way to talk about it, no way to fix it with a few kind words or a handshake. The betrayal was deep, and the road to rebuilding trust was going to take time. More time than I was ready to give. When my mom made the decision to sell our house, it was framed as the solution to a financial crisis, a way to pay off my brother's debts and bring some kind of resolution to the mess he had created. But the truth was, the price of that sacrifice wasn't just measured in money. It was measured in something far more valuable. Our peace of mind, our emotional stability, and our sense of security. And that's what made it so hard to process. While my mom thought she was solving the problem, she was actually creating a whole new set of challenges that would echo through our lives for months, maybe even years to come. Financially, things were never the same after the house was sold. Sure, we paid off the debts, and we removed that burden from our shoulders. But the emotional toll of that decision lingered far longer than I had anticipated. It wasn't just the fact that we no longer had a place to call our own. It was the fact that our entire lifestyle shifted. My mom worked hard for that house. She had poured her blood, sweat, and tears into maintaining it, making sure it was a safe haven for all of us. And in the blink of an eye, it was gone. Not because of anything she did, but because of the choices my brother made. The financial consequences went far beyond the sale of the house. We had to adjust to a new reality. My mom had to start over, finding a smaller, more affordable place to live. It wasn't just the physical move that was hard. It was the emotional one. We went from a home filled with memories to a space that felt temporary, like we were just passing through. The place we moved into wasn't bad, but it wasn't ours. There was a feeling of displacement that was hard to shake, like we didn't belong. The house had always been a symbol of stability, and now that symbol was gone. It was difficult to wrap our heads around this new life, one that was defined by financial decisions we hadn't asked for, by mistakes we hadn't made. And then there were the costs my mom paid emotionally. Her decision wasn't made lightly. It wasn't as simple as selling a property. It was the dismantling of everything she had built for us, the very foundation of what had kept us together as a family. I couldn't help but see the strain it placed on her. She was trying to stay strong for us, trying to make us believe that everything was going to be okay, but I could see the cracks. The guilt was weighing on her. She had sacrificed so much for my brother's future. But at what cost? The emotional price of that decision was written all over her face. She was a woman who had always worked tirelessly for our well-being, yet here she was, having to face the fact that she had lost her own sense of security to fix someone else's mistakes. The sense of loss wasn't just financial, it was psychological. It was the emotional cost of feeling like everything we had worked for was now tied to one person's inability to manage his finances. There were days when I could feel the tension in the air. Every conversation seemed to touch on the house, the debts, the sacrifices. No one could escape it. We had all been affected in some way, whether we wanted to admit it or not. My brother tried to make things right, but it felt like nothing could undo the damage done. The money was gone, the house was gone, and what was left was this raw emotional landscape that we all had to navigate. My mom's emotional burden was heavy, no doubt. But it was also shared. I felt it too, even though I wasn't the one who had sold the house. I couldn't shake the feeling that my brother's actions were now haunting all of us. Every day we were reminded of the price of that sacrifice. It wasn't just about money, it was about the emotional costs that come with making decisions for the sake of someone else. How do you move forward when you've given up everything for someone who might never truly understand the weight of what you've done for them? What made the emotional consequences even harder to bear was the lack of closure. My brother couldn't fix what he'd done. No amount of debt relief could bring back the memories of the house or replace the security we had once felt. The emotional scars didn't fade with time. They lingered in the quiet moments, in the spaces between conversations. Every time we moved into another house, I felt it. The empty feeling of knowing we'd never truly recover from this decision. It wasn't just the material loss. It was the intangible things that had been lost too. Even though we had paid off the debts and removed that burden from our shoulders, the emotional weight of it all didn't just vanish. The scars of that sacrifice, the emotional consequences that came with it, would be felt for a long time. And as much as I tried to look forward, as much as I wanted to leave the past behind, I couldn't ignore the lingering impact it had on our family dynamic, on our trust in each other, and on the way we saw our future. The hardest part of all of this was the realization that some things can't be fixed with money. You can pay off debts, you can move into a new place, but there are some emotional costs that no amount of money or sacrifice can ever make up for. And for my mom, the price she paid wasn't just in dollars. It was in the quiet exhaustion of knowing that, no matter what, she was always going to be the one left picking up the pieces. Rebuilding trust after something like this is never going to be easy. It's one of those things that's easier said than done. When a family goes through something as traumatic as losing their home to pay off someone else's debts, trust isn't something that just gets patched up with a few apologies and a couple of heartfelt promises. No, trust takes time, takes work. And when you've been burned as badly as we had been, it's not something you can just wave away. The scars of my brother's actions, of my mom's sacrifice, and of everything we'd gone through were still fresh in our hearts. And the journey to rebuild what had been lost felt almost impossible at times. At first, there was a lot of tension between my brother and the rest of us. The weight of the situation was heavy, and though he was trying, it felt like nothing was really changing. He apologized again and again, but the words seemed empty. What was worse was the sense of guilt that hung over him, like he was trying to buy back the love and trust that had been broken. But trust doesn't come from apologizing alone. It comes from actions. Real, consistent actions that show you understand the damage you've caused and are willing to put in the work to make things right. My brother was doing the work in his own way, but it felt like the emotional damage was so deep that no amount of good intentions could undo the hurt we all felt. I could tell he wanted to change. I could see it in his eyes every time he looked at my mom, every time he tried to do something for the family. But still, there was that invisible wall between us, the unspoken feeling that things would never be the same again. And honestly, for a long time I didn't know if we could ever move past it. My mom, who had always been the pillar of strength for all of us, was struggling too. She was caught between her love for my brother and the betrayal she felt from the entire situation. She had given everything to make sure we were taken care of. And now, there was this growing rift between them, a tension that seemed to pull us further apart the more we tried to fix it. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the fact that my brother's actions had forced us all into a corner, and that corner had left us bruised and confused. We weren't just dealing with financial hardship. We were dealing with broken relationships. We were dealing with the emotional aftermath of a decision that no one in the family had fully been prepared for. The house may have been sold to pay off debts, but in many ways, the emotional debts still remained, with interest. And those emotional debts were far harder to settle. So how do you move past this? How do you begin to rebuild something that feels irreparably broken? Well, for us, it started with having uncomfortable conversations. The kind of conversations you'd rather avoid, but that are necessary if you ever want to move forward. It wasn't easy, but little by little, we began talking about our feelings. We started acknowledging the pain, the disappointment, the fear. We allowed ourselves to be vulnerable with each other. And in that vulnerability, something shifted. Slowly but surely we began to realize that this wasn't just about forgiveness. It was about healing. And healing wasn't going to happen overnight. My mom, despite everything, started taking small steps to reassert her sense of self. She began talking to a counselor about the emotional toll of the past few months. She started to prioritize herself in ways she hadn't before. It was a huge step, and I could see the difference it made. She was beginning to trust herself again, to trust that she could make decisions that were in her best interest as well. That was huge for her and for the family. For my brother, he started showing up more. Not just physically but emotionally. He started offering to help around the house, to take responsibility for his actions. But the real change came when he started being honest with himself about why he had gotten into this situation in the first place. It wasn't about the money or the debts. It was about his own avoidance of responsibility, his fear of failure, and his reluctance to face the consequences. Once he admitted that to himself, it was like a weight lifted off his shoulders, and the rest of us could begin to see the sincerity in his attempts to change. But even with all of these changes, there were moments of doubt. Moments where I wondered if things could ever go back to the way they were before. The truth is, we all still have our scars. We all still have moments where we doubt whether we'll ever truly be able to trust again. But what I've come to realize is that rebuilding trust isn't about returning to what you once had. It's about creating something new. Trust, once broken, may never be the same again. But that doesn't mean it can't be rebuilt. Just takes time. Takes effort. Takes vulnerability. And most importantly, it takes a willingness to forgive. Not just my brother but ourselves. The path to rebuilding wasn't a straight line. There were setbacks, misunderstandings, and plenty of moments when I felt like we'd never get past it. But slowly, we started to repair the emotional damage. Little by little, we began to find our way back to each other. And while the scars of that experience will always remain, so too will the strength we gained from working through it together. Trust isn't just about what you give. It's about what you're willing to rebuild. When you've been through something as emotionally and financially draining as what our family went through, the idea of forgiveness can seem like a distant dream. For months after everything went down, I couldn't even begin to think about forgiveness. It felt like the wounds were too fresh, too deep. How could I forgive my brother for what he had done, for the emotional and financial toll he had placed on all of us? How could I forgive myself for the anger and resentment that had built up inside me? The truth was, forgiveness wasn't easy, and it wasn't going to happen overnight. But as time went on, I started to realize something. Forgiveness isn't just for the person who's wronged you. It's for you. It's about letting go of the anger, the pain, and the weight that comes with holding on to resentment. It's about freeing yourself from the emotional burden that keeps you tethered to the past. And slowly, painfully, I started to understand that forgiveness wasn't about excusing what had happened. It was about accepting the reality of the situation and moving forward with a sense of peace. For my mom, the process of forgiveness was even harder. She had sacrificed so much for us, and yet, here we were, living in the aftermath of her sacrifices. But the more I watched her, the more I realized that she wasn't just forgiving my brother. She was forgiving herself. She was learning to let go of the guilt she carried, the idea that she could have somehow prevented this. It was difficult for her to accept that some things were beyond her control, but in doing so, she began to heal. She started to find ways to take care of herself, to reconnect with the things that made her feel whole again. Forgiveness, I learned, wasn't about forgetting. It wasn't about pretending that nothing had happened. It was about giving ourselves permission to heal. And that's when I realized the true power of forgiveness. It's not just a gift you give to the other person, it's a gift you give to yourself. It's about choosing to move forward, even when the past feels heavy. It's about letting go of the emotional chains that keep you stuck in anger and resentment. For me, that meant acknowledging the hurt, feeling the pain, but then deciding that I wasn't going to let it define my relationship with my brother or my mom. For my brother, forgiveness came in the form of accountability. He couldn't expect us to just forgive him without any effort on his part. He had to prove, through actions, that he understood the impact of his decisions on the family. And honestly, that's where the real healing began. When my brother started showing us that he was taking responsibility, not just for the debts, but for the emotional fallout of his actions, something shifted. It wasn't a magical transformation, but it was a start. Slowly, he began making amends. He started showing up more, offering to help with the bills, doing what he could to ease the strain. He apologized, but his actions spoke louder than his words ever could. And that's when I realized that forgiveness is often more about actions than words. But, as with everything, forgiveness wasn't a one-time thing. It was something we had to choose every single day. It wasn't about saying, "Okay, I forgive you, let's move on," and then pretending everything was perfect. No, it was about consistently choosing to move forward, even when it was hard, even when the pain resurfaced. There were days when I thought we were back at square one, when the hurt and frustration would creep back into my heart. But what I came to understand is that healing isn't linear. It's messy, it's up and down, and it takes time. For my family, healing meant having those tough conversations. It meant talking about the things we hadn't talked about for so long. Our feelings, our fears, our expectations. We had to face the uncomfortable truth that we weren't the same family we had been before. We had changed. But that didn't mean we couldn't rebuild. That didn't mean we couldn't create something new from the ashes of what had been lost. The healing process was slow, but it was happening. Slowly but surely, we began to find our way back to each other. It also meant accepting that some things would never be the same. Our family dynamics had been forever altered by what had happened. The emotional scars would remain, and we had to learn how to live with them. But in doing so, we also learned how to love each other differently. We learned how to communicate more honestly, how to set healthier boundaries, and how to hold each other accountable without tearing each other down. And that, in itself, was a form of healing. As the months went on, I began to see my family in a new light. We had been through something incredibly difficult, but we were still here, still standing, still trying to make it work. We had come to understand that healing isn't about perfection. It's about progress. It's about taking small steps every day to rebuild what was broken, even if it takes a lifetime to fully repair. But as much as we had healed, we knew we still had a long way to go. The emotional damage wasn't something that could be undone in a matter of weeks or months. It was something that would take years to fully process. But the important thing was that we had started. We had begun the journey of forgiveness, and in doing so, we had started to heal the rift that had torn us apart. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's that family isn't just about the good times. It's easy to think of family as the people you gather with for holidays, birthdays, and family vacations, the ones who share in your joys and celebrations. But the truth is, family is also about the struggles. It's about the sacrifices you make when things get tough, the moments when you're forced to choose between what's easy and what's right. And it's about how those tough moments can either break you or make you stronger. For me, this whole situation revealed just how much sacrifice truly shapes our lives, and how much it shapes our relationships. My mom's decision to sell the house wasn't just a financial one. It was a monumental emotional sacrifice. She gave up the one thing that represented security, stability, and all the hard work she had put into creating a safe, loving home for us. And she did it without hesitation, knowing full well that it might tear her apart. She gave up everything for the sake of the family, and that kind of sacrifice is not something you can easily comprehend until you see it firsthand. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that her sacrifice wasn't just about the house. It was about everything that led to it. She had sacrificed so much for all of us over the years. She sacrificed her own dreams to make sure we had a chance at ours. She sacrificed her time, her energy, and her peace of mind to keep us together. And yet, no one had asked her to do it. It wasn't a choice she made lightly, but it was a choice that, in her mind, was the only way to preserve the family. And that's where I learned something powerful. Sacrifice, when done out of love, is never easy, but it is always transformative. My mom taught me that true love doesn't always look like grand gestures or easy choices. Sometimes it's about showing up every single day, even when it's hard, even when it feels like you're losing a part of yourself. Sometimes, love means making sacrifices that no one else will understand. But those sacrifices don't go unnoticed. They shape us, they shape our families, and they become the foundation of everything we build. But it wasn't just my mom who made sacrifices. It was all of us. We all had to adjust to a new reality. We had to come to terms with the emotional toll of losing our home, and the fact that our future was now uncertain. We had to adjust our expectations, our sense of security, and our own sense of who we were as a family. This experience made me realize just how much I had taken for granted before. I had taken for granted the roof over our heads, the security that came with it, and the belief that things would always be the same. But life has a way of throwing curveballs, and the real test of family comes when those curveballs come your way. The test isn't how well you handle the good times, it's how you handle the bad ones. And this experience tested every one of us. Through it all, though, I learned the importance of resilience. Resilience isn't about pretending everything is okay when it's not. It's about facing reality, accepting the challenges in front of you, and finding the strength to keep going. It's about understanding that sometimes life will knock you down, but it's your ability to get back up that defines you. We couldn't undo what had been done. We couldn't change the past, but we could choose how we moved forward. And that's what really mattered. We had the power to rebuild, to restore what had been broken, and to create a new foundation based on trust, love, and shared sacrifice. One of the hardest lessons I learned was about personal responsibility. My brother's debts, and the consequences they had on the entire family, made me realize how much of an impact one person's actions can have on everyone else. It wasn't just about money, it was about accountability. We all have to own our choices because our decisions affect more than just ourselves. They affect the people we love. And while my brother made amends, he also had to come to terms with the fact that his actions had changed the course of all of our lives. The emotional burden wasn't just his to carry. It was ours as well. But through it, we learned the importance of owning our mistakes and facing the consequences of our actions. In the end, this experience taught me that the true measure of a family isn't how smoothly things go, but how you come together when things fall apart. It's about being there for each other in the hardest of times, even when you don't have all the answers. And it's about recognizing that sacrifice isn't always glamorous. It's often messy, painful, and filled with uncertainty. But it's also what makes us who we are. It's what holds us together when everything else seems to be falling apart. And that's the heart of family. The sacrifices, the resilience, the mistakes, and the healing. It's all part of the journey. And while I can't say we've fully healed yet, I know that this experience has taught me more about what it means to love and to be loved than I ever could have imagined. Now that I've shared the whole journey, our family's sacrifices, the emotional and financial roller coaster, and how we've tried to rebuild from this huge setback, I want to hear from you. What would you have done in my mom's shoes? If you were faced with the choice of selling everything, including your home, to pay off a family member's debts, would you have made the same decision? I know it's a tough question, and I'm sure there's no one-size-fits-all answer. But honestly, that's what makes this situation so complicated, right? It's easy to say what we'd do in hindsight, but when you're in the middle of a crisis, the lines aren't always so clear. I really want to know your thoughts. Have you ever had to make a sacrifice like this for a loved one? Maybe it wasn't selling a house, but have you ever had to put your own well-being on the line to help someone you care about? How did it affect you? Was it worth it in the end? Or do you wish you had handled things differently? This isn't just my story. It's a story that's relatable for anyone who has ever been faced with difficult choices within their family. And I'm curious to know how you would have handled it. Also, if you've been in a situation where trust was broken, and you had to figure out how to rebuild relationships afterward, I want to hear how you managed it. Rebuilding trust is hard. It's messy. And sometimes it feels like you'll never get it back. But I know that the conversations we have about these kinds of experiences can help all of us heal a little bit more. So, whether you've been through something similar or just have some thoughts on the subject, drop a comment below. I'll be reading them, and I might even respond to some of your comments in future videos. Lastly, if you're enjoying this video and the conversation we're having, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow, and it encourages me to keep sharing these personal stories and engaging with all of you. If there's something specific you want me to talk about in the next video, or if you have any questions about this one, let me know. I'm here to share, learn, and grow with you. And hey, don't be shy. Share this video with someone you think might find it helpful or relevant. You never know, it could spark an important conversation that needs to happen. As we wrap up this journey, I want to leave you with something to think about. How do we move on when the past feels so heavy? How do we find peace and healing when everything we've known is appended? For me, the biggest lesson in all of this has been learning how to let go. Letting go of the resentment, the anger, the emotional baggage that comes with sacrifices we didn't ask for. It's about finding a way to move forward, even when the scars are still visible, even when the pain still lingers. Moving on doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean that everything goes back to the way it was before. It means finding a way to live with what happened, to accept the mistakes that were made, and to take responsibility for our part in the story. It's about choosing to release the things that no longer serve us, whether that's emotional pain, old grudges, or the idea that we can change the past. It's about letting go of the expectation that things will be perfect, that life will be fair. And once you let go, you're free. Free to rebuild, free to start fresh, and free to embrace the future without the weight of the past holding you down. So, if you're going through something similar, if you're facing a family crisis, or if you're holding on to the weight of past mistakes, know this: you don't have to do it alone. You can choose to forgive, to heal, and to move forward, one step at a time. The most important thing is that you choose to move forward. It's not about letting others off the hook. It's about freeing yourself from the burden of carrying all that hurt and disappointment. And yes, it's hard. It's messy. But it's worth it. It's worth the peace that comes with letting go. I also want to remind you that family isn't just about the good moments. It's about how we show up for each other when things get tough. It's about loyalty, sacrifice, and the hard choices we have to make. But no matter how tough things get, remember that you have the power to choose how you respond, how you heal, and how you rebuild. So, if you're finding yourself in a situation like this, take a moment to think about what you need to let go of. What's holding you back? What's weighing you down? Sometimes we hold on to things that no longer serve us, and that's okay. But it's also okay to let go, to create space for healing, and to embrace the next chapter of your life. And hey, if this video helped you in any way, if it made you think about your own family dynamics, or if it sparked something within you, make sure to subscribe. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss any future videos where we dive deep into life's toughest moments and how we can come out stronger. I'm here sharing my story, and I'd love for you to be part of the conversation. I also want to hear your thoughts. What lessons have you learned from your own family sacrifices? What's the hardest part of letting go and moving forward for you? Drop a comment below, share your experiences, and let's keep the conversation going. Thank you so much for being here and for listening. I'll see you in the next one.